On the 7th of December, 1941, as Japanese aircraft descended upon Pearl Harbor, few American military strategists understood the profound physical disparities that would define the brutal Pacific War. The average United States Marine stood 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed approximately 165 pounds, while his Japanese counterpart measured roughly 5 feet 5.5 inches and weighed merely 85 pounds. This striking difference of 3.5 inches in height and 80 pounds in weight would profoundly influence combat dynamics, tactical decisions, and ultimately, the psychological warfare waged across thousands of miles of Pacific islands. The roots of these differences stretched deep into the 19th and early 20th centuries. American soldiers benefited from abundant agricultural production, widespread access to protein-rich diets including beef, dairy, and poultry, and relatively prosperous economic conditions, despite the Great Depression. Young men who enlisted in the Marines during the early 1940s had spent their formative years in a nation where malnutrition, though present in pockets, remained far less common than in industrializing Asia. Japan's soldiers, conversely, emerged from a radically different nutritional landscape. The Japanese diet centered heavily on rice, vegetables, and fish, with red meat consumption remaining exceptionally rare until the post-war period. According to research documented in the Journal of Military History, the average caloric intake of Japanese civilians in the 1930s hovered around 2,000 calories daily, significantly lower than the American average of approximately 3,200 calories. This nutritional gap manifested not merely in weight but in bone density, muscle mass, and overall physical resilience. The Imperial Japanese Army recognized these physical limitations, yet transformed them into doctrinal advantages. Japanese military training emphasized endurance, mental discipline, and the ability to survive on minimal rations. Soldiers routinely trained while consuming fewer than 1,500 calories per day, preparing them for the resource-scarce environments they would encounter across the Pacific. The Bushido Code reinforced the notion that spiritual strength could overcome physical disadvantages, a philosophy that would prove both inspiring and devastating throughout the conflict. American military planners initially underestimated their adversaries, assuming physical superiority would translate directly to battlefield dominance. This assumption shattered during early encounters in the Philippines, Wake Island, and the Botan Peninsula, where Japanese forces demonstrated extraordinary tenacity despite their smaller stature. The Marines who survived these early battles returned with sobering reports. Size meant little when facing an enemy willing to fight to the last man. The physical differences extended beyond simple measurements. American Marines carried heavier equipment loads, typically 60 to 70 pounds of gear, which their larger frames could sustain during extended marches. Japanese soldiers, carrying approximately 45 pounds, moved with remarkable speed through jungle terrain. Their smaller size allowed them to construct more compact defensive positions, navigate dense vegetation with greater ease, and consume fewer supplies, extending their operational range considerably. By mid-1942, as American forces prepared for offensive operations in Guadalcanal, military medical officers began systematically documenting these physical disparities. Their findings would inform everything from equipment design to tactical doctrine. As the United States military adapted to fighting an enemy whose physical profile differed so dramatically from their own, the 6th of August, 1942 marked the commencement of Operation Watchtower, the Allied offensive against Guadalcanal that would become the first major test of American and Japanese forces in prolonged ground combat. First Lieutenant James Hawthorne of the 1st Marine Division stepped onto the black sand beaches, weighing 178 pounds, his 6-foot frame, typical of the Marines surrounding him. Within weeks, he would confront Imperial Japanese Army soldiers, whose average weight barely exceeded 90 pounds, yet whose ferocity in combat bore no correlation to their physical size. The dense jungle environment of Guadalcanal amplified the significance of physical differences in unexpected ways. American Marines, with their larger builds, struggled more severely with heat exhaustion and tropical diseases. Malaria, dengue, fever, and dysentery struck the Marine divisions with devastating frequency. The larger body mass of American troops meant they required more calories to maintain combat effectiveness, yet supply lines remained precarious throughout the campaign. Marines who arrived weighing 170 pounds often departed at 135, their physical advantages eroded by disease and inadequate nutrition. Japanese defenders, already adapted to lower caloric intake, demonstrated remarkable endurance, despite even more severe supply shortages. Captain Yoshiro Nakamura, commanding a rifle company in the 35th Infantry Brigade, weighed merely 92 pounds when he landed on Guadalcanal in September 1942. His training had prepared him to function on rice balls and occasional fish, a subsistence diet that would have incapacitated most Americans. According to documentation preserved in the National Archives, Japanese units on Guadalcanal sustained combat operations while consuming as few as 800 calories per day during the final months of the campaign. The physical disparities manifested distinctly in close-quarters combat. American Marines possessed advantages in hand-to-hand fighting, their superior reach and weight offering significant benefits during the brutal nighttime banzai charges that characterized Japanese tactics. Corporal Thomas McCarthy, a Boston native, standing 5 feet 11 inches and weighing 183 pounds, recorded in his diary how Japanese soldiers seemed almost childlike in stature during bayonet engagements, yet fought with a desperation that more than compensated for physical disadvantages. Japanese tactical doctrine evolved to exploit their physical characteristics. Smaller soldiers constructed elaborate underground tunnel systems and defensive positions that American Marines, with their broader shoulders and larger frames, found difficult to assault. Spider holes, individual fighting positions, barely large enough for a single Japanese soldier, became signature defensive features. These positions, uncomfortable even for their intended occupants, proved nearly impossible for larger American troops to occupy or flush out effectively. The medical evacuation statistics from Guadalcanal revealed the campaign's physical toll disproportionately. American casualties included substantial numbers of heat-related injuries and nutritional deficiencies, exacerbated by larger body sizes, requiring more resources. Japanese casualties, while numerically higher due to their refusal to surrender, included fewer cases of heat exhaustion relative to combat wounds, suggesting better physiological adaptation to tropical conditions, despite inferior supply situations. By February 1943, when Japanese forces evacuated Guadalcanal, both sides had learned crucial lessons about how physical differences influenced combat effectiveness. American commanders recognized that size alone guaranteed nothing. Japanese commanders understood their soldiers' physical limitations required tactical compensation. The campaign had transformed theoretical observations about height and weight into hard-won battlefield knowledge. In the spring of 1943, Major William Henderson sat in a Quonset hut on New Caledonia, examining captured Japanese rifles, uniforms, and equipment laid out before him. The contrast struck him immediately. Everything seemed miniaturized, as though designed for a different species. The Type 38 Arisaka rifle measured 40 inches overall, several inches shorter than the American M1 Garand. Japanese uniforms, helmets, and boots appeared almost toy-like, beside their American equivalents. This physical evidence told a story about two nations that had engineered their militaries around fundamentally different human dimensions. American military equipment design reflected the larger physique of its soldiers. The M1 Garand rifle, adopted in 1946, weighed 9.5 pounds, unloaded a manageable weight for Marines, averaging 165 pounds, but representing a proportionally greater burden for smaller soldiers. American combat boots, designed for feet averaging size 9 to 10, featured heavier leather and more substantial construction than Japanese footwear. The iconic M1 steel helmet, weighing just over 2 pounds, sat comfortably on larger American heads, but would have been unwieldy on smaller frames. Japanese equipment designers faced different constraints and priorities. The Type 38 rifle, despite its lighter weight of 8 pounds, proved remarkably effective in Japanese hands. Its shorter length suited close quarters, jungle fighting, and could be operated efficiently by soldiers with smaller stature and reach. Japanese combat boots, often criticized by Western observers as flimsy, actually represented intelligent design for smaller feet and lighter soldiers traversing varied terrain. The Japanese Type 90 helmet, weighing approximately 1.5 pounds, provided adequate protection while imposing less strain on smaller neck muscles during extended wear. Context from the United States Army Quartermaster Corps' historical records reveals that American military planners recognized these equipment disparities had operational implications. Captured Japanese weapons proved difficult for American soldiers to use comfortably, not due to inferior design, but because they were optimized for different physical proportions. Similarly, Japanese soldiers who captured American weapons often struggled with their size and weight. This mutual equipment incompatibility reinforced the distinct combat cultures each military developed. The engineering of fortifications and defensive positions reflected physical differences profoundly. Japanese bunkers on islands like Tarawa and Pelalui featured entranceways, measuring approximately 5 feet high and 2 feet wide dimensions, that allowed Japanese defenders to enter and exit efficiently, while forcing larger American attackers to expose themselves vulnerable during assault. American military engineers, planning defensive positions on captured islands, constructed fortifications with larger dimensions that Japanese forces would have found unnecessarily spacious, and vehicle design presented another dimension of physical divergence. American jeeps, trucks, and landing craft featured seats, controls, and access points sized for larger operators. Japanese vehicles, though mechanically comparable, utilized tighter spacing and smaller operator compartments. This became relevant when American forces captured Japanese vehicles and found them cramped and uncomfortable, while Japanese soldiers reported American vehicles felt cavernous and difficult to control efficiently. The dietary implications extended to field rations and logistics. American rations, designed to provide approximately 3,000 calories daily, came in packages weighing several pounds. Japanese soldiers subsisted on rice balls, dried fish, and pickled vegetables, carried in smaller quantities that reflected both their lower caloric needs and Japan's strained logistics. An American Marine required roughly twice the food supplies by weight to maintain combat effectiveness compared to his Japanese counterpart, a logistical consideration that influenced operational planning throughout the Pacific War. By late 1943, both militaries had adapted their equipment, procurement, and design based on battlefield experience, but the fundamental physical differences between their soldiers remained a constant factor in every aspect of material preparation for combat. The 21st of November, 1943 brought Marines of the 2nd Division crashing onto the beaches of Betio Island in the Tarawa Atoll, where the stark realities of physical differences in tropical warfare would be written in blood and coral. Staff Sergeant Robert Fitzgerald, a former Pennsylvania coal miner weighing 197 pounds, found himself pinned behind a disabled Amtrak as Japanese machine gun fire tore across the exposed beach. Around him, Marines struggled forward, carrying 60-pound packs through chest-deep water, their larger frames presenting substantial targets, while offering superior strength for the grueling advance. The 76-hour battle for Tarawa demonstrated how physical characteristics influenced survival in tropical combat. American casualties from heat exhaustion rivaled combat wounds during the first day, as Marines in their heavier uniforms and equipment struggled under the equatorial sun. The larger body mass that provided advantages in hand-to-hand combat became a liability, requiring more water, more food, and more energy expenditure in the scorching heat. Medical officers reported cases of heat stroke affecting Marines who had seemed physically robust in temperate climates but whose size became a burden in tropical conditions. Japanese defenders, commanded by Rear Admiral Kiji Shibasaki, had adapted their defensive strategy around their physical characteristics. Underground positions featured crawl spaces and fighting positions, sized precisely for soldiers, averaging 5 feet 5 inches and 85 pounds. When Marines finally breached these fortifications, they discovered defensive networks that required them to crouch or crawl through spaces designed to maximize Japanese advantages. Sergeant Fitzgerald, at 6 feet 1 inch, found himself unable to navigate captured bunkers without extreme difficulty, while smaller Marines moved through the tunnels with marginally less trouble. The water requirements illustrated the metabolic differences starkly. American Marines required approximately 5 to 7 quarts of water daily to maintain combat effectiveness in tropical heat, a requirement that strained logistics throughout the Pacific Campaign. Japanese soldiers, with smaller body mass and adaptation to minimal resource consumption, functioned on roughly 3 to 4 quarts daily, though chronic dehydration remained prevalent among Japanese forces due to supply line disruptions. This difference meant that securing water sources represented a greater operational necessity for American forces. Disease patterns revealed another dimension of physical vulnerability. Larger American soldiers presented more body surface area for disease-carrying mosquitoes, contributing to higher malaria infection rates in some units. However, the greater body mass also meant American soldiers could better withstand certain parasitic infections before becoming combat ineffective. Japanese soldiers, operating closer to subsistence nutrition levels even before tropical diseases struck, deteriorated more rapidly once infected, though their prior adaptation to nutritional scarcity sometimes delayed the onset of deficiency-related conditions. The tactical evolution on both sides reflected growing understanding of physical factors. American commanders increasingly employed smaller-statured Marines for tunnel reconnaissance and close-quarters fighting in captured fortifications. Japanese commanders, recognizing they could not match American firepower or physical strength in open combat, doubled down on defensive tactics that exploited their size advantages, constructing increasingly elaborate underground positions, where American physical superiority meant little. By early 1944, Marine Corps training began incorporating lessons learned about tropical warfare and physical differences. Training at locations like Camp Pendleton emphasized acclimatization, weight reduction in equipment loads, and tactics for fighting in confined spaces. Meanwhile, Japanese forces throughout the Pacific, increasingly cut off from supplies, saw their already lighter soldiers losing dangerous amounts of weight. Reports from captured documents indicated some Japanese units averaged 75 pounds per soldier by mid-1944, a starvation-level weight that nonetheless allowed them to continue fighting with fanatical determination. The physical disparities that had seemed like clear American advantages in 1941 had proven far more complex in practice, with tropical environments creating unique challenges that size and strength alone could not overcome. On the 15th of June, 1944, Marines stormed the beaches of Saipan, initiating one of the Pacific War's bloodiest campaigns. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Daniel Morrison witnessed the human cost of physical differences from a unique vantage point, treating wounded from both sides in the chaos following the initial landings. The broken bodies told stories that strategic planning documents could not capture, stories of how height, weight, and physical structure influenced who lived and who died in modern warfare. American wounded presented distinct injury patterns related to their larger frames. Corpsman Morrison observed that Marines struck by Japanese rifle fire often sustained wounds that, while serious, proved more survivable than comparable wounds to smaller-framed Japanese soldiers. A bullet through the shoulder of a 170-pound Marine might miss vital organs that, in an 85-pound Japanese soldier, sat proportionally closer to the impact site. Conversely, the larger target profile of American troops meant they sustained higher rates of initial hits from defensive fire. The mathematics of combat proved grimly simple. More body mass meant both larger targets and greater capacity to absorb damage. The psychological dimensions of physical differences emerged in the testimonies of veterans. Private First Class George Patterson, a Midwesterner standing 6 feet 2 inches and weighing 188 pounds, later recounted his first encounter with a Japanese soldier during night fighting on Saipan. "He came at me out of the darkness," Patterson wrote decades later, "and my first thought was how small he looked. Then he was on me with a bayonet, and his size didn't matter at all. He was trying to kill me with everything he had, and I realized that courage and determination had nothing to do with how tall you stood." This recognition that physical disparities meant little when facing an enemy willing to die fighting transformed many American perceptions of their adversaries. Japanese soldiers experienced their own psychological reckoning with physical differences. Captured diaries and post-war interviews revealed that many Japanese troops initially felt intimidated by the size of American Marines. Private Takeshi Yamamoto, captured on Saipan, later described his shock at first seeing American prisoners. "They looked like giants to us, impossibly large and well-fed. We had been told we were fighting soft Americans who would break easily, but these men looked like they could break us with their bare hands." This physical intimidation contributed to Japanese tactical emphasis on night attacks and close-quarters combat, where surprise and determination might offset size disadvantages. The medical evacuation statistics from Saipan revealed the compounding effects of physical differences and resource availability. American casualties received relatively rapid evacuation to hospital ships equipped with modern surgical facilities, blood plasma, and antibiotics. Japanese wounded, cut off from organized medical support, faced survival odds that deteriorated rapidly. The larger physical reserves of American soldiers meant they could better survive the trauma of combat wounds and the stress of evacuation, while Japanese soldiers, operating closer to subsistence body weight, succumbed more frequently to shock and infection. Starvation became a defining feature of Japanese defensive positions by mid-1944. On Saipan, defending forces averaged approximately 70 pounds per soldier. By the battle's conclusion, a weight loss that transformed already smaller men into skeletal figures barely capable of carrying weapons. American intelligence officers, examining dead Japanese defenders, found soldiers whose arms measured barely 6 inches in circumference, their bodies consuming muscle mass to survive. Yet these starving men fought with undiminished ferocity, suggesting that physical deterioration alone could not break the Japanese will to resist. The civilian population on Saipan added another tragic dimension to the physical narrative. Thousands of Japanese civilians, subjected to propaganda warning of American atrocities, and confronting Marines whose size seemed monstrous to them, chose suicide over capture. The physical differences between occupier and occupied contributed to mutual incomprehension and tragedy, as cultural and physical foreignness reinforced the dehumanization that warfare demanded. By the battle's end on the 9th of July, 1944, over 3,000 American Marines lay dead alongside nearly 30,000 Japanese soldiers and 10,000 civilians. The physical differences that had seemed so significant proved ultimately irrelevant in the face of modern warfare's indiscriminate lethality. The 19th of February 1945 dawned gray and cold as Marines of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Divisions approached the black volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima. Among them, Corporal Michael Chun, a Chinese-American from San Francisco standing 5 feet 7 inches and weighing 148 pounds, represented a physical middle ground between the American and Japanese averages. His presence highlighted an often overlooked aspect of the Pacific War. Not all American servicemen matched the statistical profile of height and weight superiority, yet they fought with equal effectiveness. Iwo Jima would become the supreme test of physical endurance for both sides. The island's defender, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had constructed the most sophisticated defensive network Japanese engineers had yet achieved. 11 miles of underground tunnels connected 1,500 fortified positions, all sized for soldiers averaging 85 pounds and 5 feet 5 inches. American forces, encountering these defenses, discovered that their physical advantages meant almost nothing in the subterranean warfare that dominated the battle. The volcanic soil and claustrophobic tunnels created a nightmarish environment where size became a distinct disadvantage. Marines attempting to clear fortified caves found themselves crawling through passages barely 2 feet high and 3 feet wide. Lance Corporal William Burke, a former college football player from Chicago weighing 212 pounds, became stuck in a tunnel entrance while pursuing Japanese defenders, requiring 2 men to pull him free while under fire. Smaller Marines increasingly took point positions in tunnel fighting, their reduced frames allowing marginally better mobility in the stifling darkness. Japanese defenders exploited their size advantages with devastating effect. Soldiers could navigate the tunnel networks rapidly, emerging from concealed positions to attack, then disappearing before American forces could respond effectively. The defensive strategy transformed physical characteristics into tactical assets. Smaller soldiers required less oxygen in sealed chambers, could store supplies in more compact spaces, and moved through restricted passages with life-saving speed. An American flamethrower operator, burdened with 70 pounds of equipment and his own body weight, averaging 170 pounds, moved at perhaps 1/3 the speed of a Japanese defender, carrying a rifle and 20 pounds of gear. The physical toll accumulated relentlessly. American casualties included numerous instances of Marines collapsing from exhaustion while carrying wounded comrades up Iwo Jima's steep volcanic slopes. The larger body mass that provided strength advantages also meant greater energy expenditure traversing the island's punishing terrain. Japanese defenders, lighter and adapted to minimal nutrition, nonetheless suffered catastrophic attrition. By March 1945, surviving Japanese soldiers averaged 65 pounds, their bodies consuming themselves to continue fighting. Medical examinations of dead Japanese defenders revealed men who had literally starved to death while still holding defensive positions. The famous flag raising on Mount Suribachi, on the 23rd of February, 1945, captured 6 Marines, whose physical profiles reflected American diversity. Sergeant Michael Strank stood 5 feet 10 inches and weighed 168 pounds. Corporal Harlan Block measured 6 feet and 185 pounds. Private First Class Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian, stood 5 feet 10 inches and weighed 155 pounds. Their varying sizes demonstrated that, while statistical averages told one story, individual variation told another. American military strength came not from uniform physical characteristics, but from diversity in size, background, and capability. The 26-day battle cost nearly 7,000 American lives and 21,000 Japanese defenders. The physical differences that had seemed so significant at the wars. The beginning had been ground down by industrial warfare's brutal mathematics. Size mattered in specific tactical situations, but courage, training, and material superiority mattered more. By the time Marines secured Iwo Jima, on the 26th of March, 1945, the physical disparities between combatants had been rendered almost meaningless by the totality of violence both sides had endured. The 1st of April, 1945 brought the war's largest amphibious operation to Okinawa, where American forces would confront not only Japanese military defenders, but a civilian population caught between opposing armies. First Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, an Army nurse from Virginia, arrived on Okinawa 3 days after the initial landings, expecting to treat combat casualties. Instead, she found herself confronting the war's physical realities from a profoundly human perspective, treating soldiers and civilians whose bodies told stories of nutrition, genetics, and the brutal calculus of modern warfare. The 10th Army, comprising both Marine and Army divisions, represented the full spectrum of American physical diversity. Soldiers ranged from 5 feet 4 inches to over 6 feet, with weights spanning from 130 to over 200 pounds. This variation contrasted sharply with Japanese defenders, whose uniformity in smaller stature reflected Japan's more ethnically homogeneous population and consistent nutritional patterns. The Japanese 32nd Army defending Okinawa averaged 5 feet 5 inches and 78 pounds per soldier starvation weights. That reflected supply line collapsed, but not diminished fighting capability. Lieutenant Mitchell observed that physical differences influenced medical treatment profoundly. American wounded required more blood, plasma, more medications, and more calories during recovery than their body weight ratios would predict, suggesting that Americans' larger frames had adapted to higher metabolic baselines. Japanese prisoners, when they could be convinced to accept treatment, survived on minimal medical resources. Their bodies adapted to scarcity. One Japanese soldier, weighing 69 pounds when captured, recovered sufficiently to walk within days, despite wounds that would have immobilized larger men for weeks. The civilian population of Okinawa added heartbreaking complexity to the physical narrative. Okinawan civilians averaged smaller than even Japanese soldiers, with adult men typically standing 5 feet 2 inches and weighing approximately 75 pounds. Women and children appeared even smaller, their frames shaped by generations of subsistence agriculture and periodic famine. When American forces encountered civilian refugees, the physical differences created communication barriers beyond language. Gestures, meant to be reassuring from 6-foot Marines, appeared threatening to people who had been taught to fear these giant foreigners. The 82-day campaign ground both sides down through attrition. American forces, despite superior logistics, struggled with the physical demands of fighting in Okinawa's muddy, mountainous terrain during the rainy season. Equipment loads that seemed manageable in training became crushing burdens in thigh-deep mud. Japanese defenders, already operating at starvation weights, deteriorated further. Post-battle examinations revealed Japanese soldiers weighing as little as 58 pounds, their bodies cannibalizing muscle tissue to maintain basic functions while continuing to fight. The tactical stalemate in southern Okinawa, where Japanese forces held defensive positions for months despite overwhelming American advantages, demonstrated that physical differences meant progressively less as both sides adapted. American forces learned to employ smaller soldiers for infiltration missions and close-quarters combat. Japanese forces, recognizing they could not physically match American troops in any conventional sense, perfected defensive tactics that negated size advantages. The result was a grinding battle of attrition, where physical characteristics mattered far less than willpower, firepower, and logistical sustainability. By the 21st of June, 1945, when organized Japanese resistance ended on Okinawa, over 12,000 Americans and 100,000 Japanese soldiers had died, along with perhaps 150,000 Okinawan civilians. The physical differences that had fascinated military planners in 1941 had been subsumed into the larger horror of total war. Size, weight, and physical strength proved marginal factors compared to industrial capacity, technological advantage, and the willingness of both sides to accept catastrophic casualties. The war's end approached with both sides transformed by the physical ordeal. American forces, despite better logistics, showed the accumulated effects of years of tropical warfare, with chronic malaria, parasitic infections, and nutritional deficiencies affecting combat effectiveness. Japanese forces, cut off from resupply and reduced to desperation, fought on with bodies that had been physically consumed by the war effort. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 would end the war before the physical differences between combatants could be tested in the planned invasion of Japan's home islands. In the autumn of 1945, as occupation forces moved into Japan, American soldiers encountered the Japanese population directly for the first time in peaceful circumstances. The physical differences that had defined combat encounters now appeared in a different light. Sergeant Raymond Thompson, a military policeman from Ohio, stood in Tokyo's ruins, surrounded by civilians, whose average height reached his chest. The context had changed everything. Where physical size had once marked enemies in combat, it now highlighted the shared humanity of victor and vanquished. Post-war analysis by military historians and medical researchers sought to understand how physical differences had influenced the Pacific War's conduct and outcome. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducting comprehensive assessments of Japan's wartime conditions, documented the severe nutritional deprivation Japanese civilians and soldiers had endured. Average caloric intake in Japan had fallen to approximately 1,500 calories daily by 1945, less than half the American average. This data explained not only the physical disparities between combatants, but also why Japanese military resistance had proven so tenacious despite resource shortages. Soldiers and civilians alike had adapted to survival on minimal nutrition. The occupation period revealed the physical differences' roots in economic and agricultural systems rather than inherent biological distinctions. Japanese children born after 1945, benefiting from improved nutrition, including increased protein consumption, would eventually average significantly taller than their parents' generation. By the 1970s, the height gap between Americans and Japanese had narrowed considerably, demonstrating that the wartime physical disparities reflected nurture rather than nature. Veterans from both sides gradually shared their experiences, and common themes emerged. American veterans spoke of their surprise at Japanese soldiers' physical toughness, despite smaller size. Japanese veterans recalled their initial intimidation at American physical size, giving way to recognition that courage and determination transcended physical measurements. Marine Corps veteran Thomas Patterson, interviewed in 1983, reflected, "We were bigger and stronger, sure, but that didn't matter as much as we thought it would. The Japanese fought like men defending their homes, because that's what they were doing. Size didn't make them less dangerous or less dedicated." The equipment and tactical lessons learned during the Pacific War influenced military planning for decades. American military designers recognized that one-size-fits-all equipment approaches failed to accommodate the physical diversity within American forces, let alone potential allies of different physical profiles. Japanese military thinkers, in the post-war self-defense forces, emphasized that smaller physical stature required compensation through technology, training, and tactical innovation. Lessons learned painfully during the Pacific War. The human dimension of physical differences extended beyond purely military considerations. The Pacific War's racial dimensions had been inextricably linked to physical differences, with both sides engaging in dehumanizing propaganda that emphasized physical characteristics. American propaganda portrayed Japanese soldiers as subhuman due partly to their smaller size. Japanese propaganda depicted Americans as barbaric giants. Post-war reconciliation required confronting how physical differences had been weaponized for propaganda purposes, turning natural human variation into markers of otherness and inferiority.